This is Just Asking Questions, a show for inquiring minds on reason.
Are embryos people? And are there downsides to designer babies? Just Asking Questions. I'm Zach Weissmuller, senior producer for Reason, joined by my co-host Liz Wolfe, Reason associate editor and author of the Reason Roundup newsletter, which you can and should get delivered to your inbox every weekday morning. Hey, Liz.
Hey, Zach.
Earlier this year, Alabama's Supreme Court handed down a controversial decision declaring that frozen embryos should be treated as unborn children and therefore their destruction be treated legally as a wrongful death, leaving in vitro fertilization clinics with a big problem. Less than a month later, the state's Republican governor, Ivey, signed into law a bill protecting access to IVF treatment in the state. As Reason reported at the time, the court ruling had caused near immediate chaos, with 3 IVF providers in the state shutting down operations. Widespread backlash ensued, including from conservatives like Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who told CNN that we want to make it easier for people to have babies, not make it harder. And IVF process is a way of giving people life to giving life to even more babies. Today's guest is not only pro-IVF as a fertility treatment, but pro-IVF as a way to select desirable genetic traits for their offspring. Diana Fleischman is an evolutionary psychologist, a regular host of the Aporia podcast, and creator of the Sentient Substack. Diana, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Let me restate that opening question for you to kick this off. Are embryos people?
Embryos are potential people. I've talked about sentientism, which is prioritizing the moral value based on sentience. I was vegan for nearly a decade, so I have thought a lot about what sentience means, and I don't think embryos are sentient. I do see that people have an attachment to embryos, but they don't suffer, and I don't think that disposing of embryos is any kind of a moral problem. I have talked at length with a woman called Emma Waters who works for the Heritage Foundation, and she's written some stuff about this, and she thinks that even keeping them on ice, indefinitely is a grave moral sin. And so given that the birth rates are falling, and I went to this natalism conference back in December, there are these conversations about what kinds of interventions are permissible. And certainly some of the more traditional people who are trying to increase the birth rates think it's not permissible to create embryos that you may never use.
So you define a lot of your beliefs around this concept of sentience. It's in your Substack name, it's in your Twitter username, and you just gave it in your opening answer there. Could you define it a little bit more in detail for us? You mentioned suffering. Does it have something to do with the capacity to endure suffering?
Exactly. So sentience is the ability to experience suffering. So if an organism can experience, it's not just the experience of pain, because, let's say I cut off your finger and I put it on a stove, right? It would still have nerve endings and there'd still become some kind of pain there, but there'd be nowhere it was aggregated. There would be nowhere that it was felt. So sentience is the ability to experience suffering, exactly. But also sentience is the ability to experience pleasure. And I don't think embryos have either. As I said, I have more understanding now. I talk about how, being vegan for many, many years has actually made me more sympathetic to people who have fringe views and more sympathetic to the idea that they have these views are there morally central to their views. They're not, there's this quip about people restricting abortion because they want to control women. There's all these cynical views about conservatives and traditionalists, and I disagree with them, but I wouldn't want to caricature their views as some kind of evil, cynical ideal of how women should be put down in society. Yeah.
So why is sentience central to your moral and ethical framework?
I'm a utilitarian, and utilitarianism makes sense so utilitarianism is don't want to get too in the philosophical weeds here, but it's a kind of consequentialism. I'm interested in the consequences, good or bad, in terms of pain or pleasure, of various different outcomes. And to me, being able to select an embryo, for example, that has a lower risk of mental health problems is a net good, because the other embryos that you don't select don't experience suffering, and not existing is, in some small sense, a harm for them. But it's good to bring people into the world who I think will have good lives on average.
With your framework, Sentience, that you look at, I imagine many things follow from that. But our society currently, this isn't that widely shared of a belief. I think sentience factors into many people's moral equations, but how would our society look different if sentience were the starting point, the way that it is for you?
I'm going to be talking to my collaborator, my co-host, Bo Weingart on Aporia about this, but there seems to be a conflict between two different kind of worldviews. One is kind of sentientism, which is looking at the sentience of organisms, and the other one is a sort of moral repugnance, right? Or the wisdom of repugnance. So for me, I would say that there should be lab meat, because it's bad when an organism suffers to create meat. It's bad when chickens are farmed in a way that causes intense suffering for them to produce eggs. Things like uterine prolapse, the way that the male chicks are ground up, things like that are really horrible aspects of factory farming. Because I think that even chicks, like chickens, are deeply sentient in a way that embryos are just not. Whereas somebody might say, I'm against lab-grown meat, or in vitro meat, or cultured meat, or clean meat, all the different words for it, because it disgusts me to think about it. And there's a wisdom to that disgust. Similarly, it can morally disgust people, the idea of throwing away human beings, which would be the way that some traditionalists would put it. Whereas from a sentientist perspective, they're not sentient. And so it is, it's not really a harm. Although I'll kind of say that I do think that being brought into existence, I think not existing is a sort of harm. Derek Parfit talks about this a lot. He's another utilitarian, but I don't think that it's as great a harm as suffering when alive.
What abortion beliefs follow from sentience as the starting point?
I think that certainly there's a certain, level of abortion access. I don't know exactly when embryos become sentient, but I don't think that it's, like there's a heartbeat bill in Texas, and that basically makes abortion illegal, because heartbeats are found very, very early in gestation. I think 6 weeks in gestation.
Yeah.
Before the point that most women know that they're pregnant. So I would say that there probably should be cutoffs in terms of when embryos or fetuses become sentient. But very soon, the point of viability is going to be all the way at conception, and that's going to cause a lot of problems, because the laws have been sort of based on when a conceptus is viable. And now it's going to be extremely early, even at the embryo stage, or in a few years, when artificial wombs are more common or have been rolled out to the public. So I think that sentience does not correspond with external viability in the light of new technology. I don't know what, I would probably say sometime in the second trimester is when embryos become, or fetuses become viable. Yeah.
But do we have I'm not up on what is the best evidence that we have as to when in fetal development sentience begins?
It'd be like feeling suffering, pain, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I think these things are based on animal models mostly, because you can't remove even if you worked in an abortion clinic, I don't think that would be anything that people would do, would be to test on the fetal cells or the fetus itself to see whether or not it experienced pain. We know that at 22 weeks, I had a friend who gave birth to her daughters extremely early in gestation, and certainly they seemed to respond to her in a way that indicated sentience. I wouldn't know exactly when in gestation. I'm not a neonatologist, but I wouldn't know exactly when. But certainly from a sentientist perspective, abortion should be legal up to a certain point.
Yeah. Okay.
I want to return us to the Alabama case in a second, but I want to linger on one thing you brought up here, which is the sort of political push and pull between your point of view and people who have a low disgust threshold.
Yeah.
It was just interesting to me because, Jonathan Haidt has done work on political psychology and found that people in the libertarian cohort, which is a large portion of our audience, have a very high disgust threshold. It takes a lot to quote unquote disgust them. But you mentioned that your co-host there believes there's a certain wisdom to disgust. Maybe you do as well. Could you explain that a little bit?
Sure. The wisdom of repugnance is this idea that we should consider things that disgust us with a special philosophy, that we should consider whether they're moral or immoral, that there's a wisdom to our gut instincts, for example. Whereas one thing that I am an expert on is disgust. I did a PhD on disgust, and disgust is a guide that humans have for what is good to eat and what isn't good to eat, also who should be ostracized, and perhaps also who should avoid because they're sick. And novel, visceral things like artificial wombs, like cultured meat, are things that disgust us. But the only barrier between those things and not being disgusted is really familiarity. So the wisdom of repugnance is fine, but it used to be in the 80s that there was some controversy about IVF. There was even controversy about testing embryos for breast cancer gene back in the 90s and early 2000s. That was going to lead to designer babies. And the Overton window keeps moving here. And yes, you're right that Jonathan Haidt and some other people have looked at libertarians. The libertarians are similar to conservatives, except they have very low disgust sensitivity. And that's part of, I think effective altruists, which is another community that I belong to, also have this characteristic, which is called high decoupling. That is, you can separate a concept from how it makes you feel or necessarily its history, and you can look at it on its merits by itself. And I think that that's a big difference between conservatives and libertarians, and progressives as well, who also often don't think about their repugnance. They let themselves become familiar with something before they use their gut.
Are there any examples, though, where this repugnance, this disgust really does come in handy and where we use it really well?
I mean, arguably, the moral dumbfounding stuff that Jonathan Haidt has come up with, I can't remember the names of the characters in this vignette, but, Sally and Joe are brother and sister, and they decide to have sex, and she's on birth control and he uses a condom, and they like it, but they decide never to do it again. And arguably, the wisdom of repugnance is one reason is for incest, right? A brother-sister incest has about a 40% chance of having offspring that have serious conditions. And when I wrote my piece for my blog called "You're Probably a Eugenicist," I actually have this preamble, which is about this couple in Germany who met when they were teenagers, and they're brother and sister, and they ended up in a relationship together. They had 4 children, and 3 of them have serious physical problems, health problems. And the German state imprisoned the man in this couple for many, for years, because he was in a sexual relationship with his sister, right? And so that is actually technically eugenics. You don't want brothers and sisters to have offspring, but it's something that viscerally repulses us. In the same way, in the United States, where first cousin marriage is often illegal, marrying your first cousin, having children with your first cousin, having sex with your first cousin is viscerally disgusting to some people. Whereas in Afghanistan, 50% or more of marriages are between first cousins. So there's a cultural difference there.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, interesting.
And does that create bad population effects? Like, what's the outcome?
That's a spicy idea. Yeah. That is one major idea.
Things be going well in Afghanistan right now? I mean, not amazing.
That's how we boil it down to? Yeah, I don't know.
That's one major idea. And not just that, there's a whole variety of reasons because of Islam why first cousins are more likely to marry, but the likelihood of a couple who are unrelated to have a child who has some kind of birth defects or congenital defects is around 2.5% to 3%, and it's doubled in the case of first cousins. So it's not like the 40% that it is with if you were to just have a child with your first cousin and you hadn't been doing it for many generations, it would probably be fine. It'd probably be similar to like a 40-year-old woman having a baby, which also has higher rates of birth defects, right? And I've done that. I'm biased in favor of 40-year-old women having babies because I did that myself. But if you look at what they called like double first cousins, which is what often happens, where people are having babies with their cousins so often that there might just be very few sets of grandparents between the two.
News
So
you can use, just asking questions, listeners.
Yeah. Let me take us back to the Alabama case for a second, because your moral framework grows out of this idea of sentience. The judge's ruling in this case was based more on a theological argument. They were regularly referencing the Bible, the Old Testament, and this is where we get the idea that there's a legal protection for an embryo because this is something that is created in God's image, and therefore it is a transgression to kill it either on purpose or, in this case, by accident. The way it happened, I think, is worth talking about. This is just from the court documents. I'm going to read a little bit of the highlighted portion. The plaintiff's IVF treatments, there was a couple who was getting IVF treatments, and it led to the creation of several embryos, some of which were implanted and resulted in the births of healthy babies. The plaintiffs contracted to have their remaining embryos kept in the center's cryogenic nursery. A patient at the hospital managed to wander into the center's fertility clinic through an unsecured doorway. The patient then entered the cryogenic nursery and removed several embryos. The sub-zero temperatures at which the embryos had been stored freeze-burned the patient's hand, causing the patient to drop the embryos on the floor, killing them. This is a bizarre... That alone is a bizarre aspect of the story that I tried to go down a lot.
Me too.
Rabbit hole to find out.
I actually asked
how did
Twitter,
this person?
Who is this insane person who goes into a cryonics nursery and removes embryos? And I think this person must be either not fit to stand trial or not fit to, or already in prison, because it would make more sense for the parents to sue this probably insane man. For destroying their embryos, rather than the clinic for not securing the embryos adequately, right? And I'm not a law scholar, but it seems to me that there must be some. This reminds me of another case where there's a couple, Janet and Wendy Norman, who used a sperm donor to make a son. And when he was 15 or 16, he had these serious problems. He became very mentally ill. He acted out a lot. And they found out that the sperm donor that they used, that they bought sperm at this one clinic called Zyrtec, was not a guy with a PhD who was like an upstanding citizen. He was a guy with schizophrenia, bipolar, a criminal record, and he had lied about all of these characteristics. He was the hot sperm donor at this place. He sired 36 children.
Oh my God.
And the case was settled out of court in the end, but the Georgia Supreme Court, I think it was the Georgia Supreme Court, said something to the effect of, there's no wrongful life suit. You can't sue somebody for bringing a life into existence that you think shouldn't have brought into existence. So it was very hard for them legally to figure out how to adjudicate this, because they would have preferred to have a son without all these genetic problems. And this embryo case reminds me of it. That the recklessness or whatever of one guy has caused all these downstream effects, in litigation.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also, that does make me wonder what you think. I know you're not a lawyer, but just like from a moral standpoint, I think you and I are both pro-IVF and more pro-life than Liz, perhaps, but like we would still think, or more pro-choice than Liz, I would say. But we also, I think there should be some sort of compensation for someone whose embryos are damaged. I don't know if we treat it, and it's not exactly property. It's not exactly a human being. I mean, the same question comes up whenever someone, these questions have come up when a pregnant woman has the fetus that's growing inside her killed. Do you hold that person responsible for murder, even though we don't consider it legally to be a, fully fledged person? How do you have any thoughts on what's the best way to think about that?
Yeah, I also tried to look up these two couples. You probably did the same, Zach. I was interested in, what was going on with them. And it seems like these embryos are their last possible opportunity to have a child. They're too old to go through another IVF cycle. Yeah. Relatedly, there is this technology that will be possible potentially in the future where you could make pluripotent stem cells out of your tissue, and then you can make hundreds or thousands of gametes. in the future, you might be able to select amongst 100 embryos instead of 5 or 10 embryos.
Wow.
So you might be able to select, very Gattaca style, the one genius that you might have in your genetic lottery, right? Well, in this case, I just don't know how you would make somebody whole if you've lost their one opportunity to have a child, right? I think that perhaps they should have been given, I don't know, some free IVF cycles to make more embryos. But while I don't think that there was a murder done here, there certainly was grave harm committed to these people who may never have a chance to have a child that they deeply wanted.
That's right.
The future that you're describing to me sounds fairly dystopian, which is a common sentiment that many pro-life people and more conservative people share. But I wanted to just ask, because I'm legitimately very open-minded and very intrigued by your perspective, Diana. I mean, all of us are parents, right? I mean, even before we started recording this, we were talking about how, my son is like very highly risk-taking, really like he's like 1.5 and like already trying to like skateboard and he keeps wiping out and like injuring himself. And Zach was talking about how his middle son, when he was a little bit younger, shared these same characteristics. Diana, I mean, you have 2 kids too. All of us as parents and also people who think deeply about these questions, like what do we make of a future in which you can legitimately select the smartest and like most talented of 100 embryos versus the kind of beauty and joy of parenting, which is that we're just dealt a child and we have very little control over who that individual is, and it's our job to cultivate and honor that individual, and we learn things in the process of doing so. Like how do you look at that, Diana? Because I imagine you've given this a lot of thought.
Now that I'm a mom, I do recognize there's some movie that I saw where this man, he goes back in time and he goes forward in time, and then he realizes that the child that's born is different because he had, I don't know, sex with his wife in a different point in time, and he can't stand that, so he gets to go back in time. I can't remember what that was. But in any case, it is true that you have an attachment to your children as they are, as chance and nature dealt them to you, right?
Or God, in my view, right? Like,
yes, yeah. So Simone and Malcolm Collins have been in the news a lot lately. They're this pronatalist couple.
Oh yeah,
and they have 2 sons that they didn't select, and now they have 2 daughters. One who they selected for a reduced risk of mental health problems, the other that they selected for IQ, right? Because they had 10 embryos and they could choose. They call it prioritizing them because they actually think that they're going to use many of these embryos because they're trying to get to, I don't know, 8, 10. It depends on who you ask, kids, her or him, how many kids they're trying to get to, right?
Many such cases.
Yeah, exactly. So it's interesting because, they love their kids all the same, but they can't imagine having different kids. Their sons, they can't imagine having different kids. And that's a sort of moral repugnance, right? You don't want to feel like you would regret having the child that you didn't have. Whereas in terms of a dystopia, I don't see it as dystopic at all. To me, your attitude just comes from a place of this is unfamiliar and strange, right?
Sure.
If you had 10 children, you would probably have a couple that you thought were smart, were wonderful in various different ways. And thinking that one of your children was the smartest or the most mentally stable or the kindest wouldn't necessarily mean that you didn't like the other kids. But in this case, you would be choosing not to have the others.
Well, so we are treading into Gattaca territory. You already mentioned Gattaca, and we've pulled a clip from that film. It's a 1997 movie starring Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman, where the premise is that most people, the majority, are genetically engineered for certain traits. But there's this one guy played by Ethan Hawke who is not, and he's trying to get into this elite squadron and kind of fake his way into it. So John is going to roll this clip for us so we can talk a little bit about designer babies.
They used to say that a child conceived in love has a greater chance of happiness. They don't say that anymore. I'll never understand what possessed my mother to put her faith in God's hands rather than those of her local geneticist. 10 fingers, 10 toes, that's all that used to matter. Not now. Now, only seconds old, the exact time and cause of my death was already known.
Neurological condition, 60% probability. Manic depression, 42% probability. Attention deficit disorder, 89% probability. Heart disorder, 99% probability. Early fatal potential. Life expectancy, 30.2 years.
30 years.
The name for the certificate?
Anton?
No, Vincent Anton.
Seemed maybe a little far-fetched back in 1997, not so much now. As
Well,
Liz...
it's a little rude to read out your child's cause of death, and that swaddle was garbage. Now I know.
Yeah, that's the real problem with the clip.
But most people viewed that as a dystopian film, Liz included, I'm sure. But you, not so much.
It's dystopian for the scenes that don't include Uma Thurman, but the scenes with Uma Thurman, I'm like, this is the best film ever created. He's clearly been genetically engineered.
I've made a joke on Twitter that Gattaca is about a world that's much better for everybody except one guy. And you just happen to be following that one guy around.
Expand on that though. What do you? You're joking, but you're kind of serious. Like that the world is better. Yeah,
it's a world in which everybody is less likely to have mental health problems, and you also think about the externalities, right? Somebody who's 30 years old, they fall in love, they have a child, and then they die of a heart attack. You think about the externalities of somebody with schizophrenia.
Although,
or bipolar.
hold on, I should point out that in the movie he does not die. He's the 10. He survives the odds. They gave him 90% odds, and he was in the 10%.
Plot armor. Yeah, that's fine.
Sorry, continue.
Yeah. So he doesn't, and that's I remember also the scene with the contact lenses. Yeah, I mean, I don't. So there's a lot of assumptions in this film. Some of the assumptions in this film are that when you have the possibility of genetically screening embryos, that everybody who's like born naturally is going to be considered garbage, right? And this is also this like transient period between when everybody's selected genetically and then only some people or nobody's selected genetically, where there's this natural hierarchy. So the movie is really from a progressive viewpoint about how this hierarchy is bad, about how valuing some people more than others is bad, and about how just because you have medical or genetic or mathematical odds on something, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to happen. There's the magical quality of conception and bringing a baby into the world. That's actually a more traditional view. I think that's more like a religious view, that there's a magical or imbued with God aspect to conceiving new people. So I think there's a lot of things about the movie that wouldn't necessarily happen. But I do think that a world in which people were selected such that they didn't have mental and physical health problems would be a better world overall, not a dystopia at all. Yeah.
I saw you post this chart from a study, and I've linked the study in the description, as we always do. This was essentially some researchers screened about 1,400 people to get their, this was last year in 2023, to get their attitudes about this, about what they call polygenic embryo screening. Maybe before we even get into this, you could explain what that term means. Is that essentially what we're talking about here?
Yeah. So polygenic refers to the fact that most characteristics are the result of many different genes as opposed to one gene. So now they do these genome-wide association studies where they look at somebody's genotype and they, this is, if you've ever done 23andMe, they'll say like, you have a 50% chance of having green eyes, you have a 20% chance of snoring or having curly hair or whatever the case may be. And that is from a polygenic score that 23andMe has used. So if you do this with embryos, let's say you make 10 embryos if you're really lucky, and you take a cell from each of them and you get the genetics of each of those embryos, what you do is you prioritize which embryos you're going to use based on how likely they are to have or not have different physical and mental conditions. So it's fairly uncontroversial to use this to, for example, have let's say that your mother dies of cancer and you want an embryo to be less likely to die of that same cancer. That's actually one thing that Simone and Malcolm did, because Simone's mother died of a specific cancer. That's one thing that they lowered the risk for when they chose their daughter. But there's also other things that are possible. So now you have polygenic risk scores for things like educational attainment, borderline personality disorder, not borderline, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and things like that. And like, let's say somebody has a schizophrenic parent, they're likely, I can't remember what the percentage is. I think they're 5% likely to have a child with schizophrenia. If you use a polygenic embryo screening, you could lower that to something like 2%, right?
So
sorry.
that concept was explained to the participants in the survey, and this is what their reaction was to various questions. Do you approve or disapprove of people using polygenic embryo screening? The green is light green is approve, dark green strongly approve. Added together, it's like 72% and approve. High approval for the idea that if you and your partner were undergoing in vitro fertilization, how interested would you be in using polygenic embryo screening? The vast majority are at least slightly interested. Suppose you were to have a child, would you consider undergoing in vitro fertilization for the specific purpose of using polygenic embryo screening, which is what this couple you were referring to, Diana, did. They opted in.
Yeah.
Is that right? They voluntarily opted into IVF when they didn't need IVF.
No, they also needed it, but they would have, in retrospect, they say that they would have done it anyway. So yes, she could not conceive naturally. So I think she started in her 20s, and then they started doing IVF for that reason. But now they did an IVF cycle specifically, the last one they did, to make embryos so that they could screen them. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a minority at this point of people who would undergo, because IVF is an expensive and laborious process. Not many people are willing to opt in it for specifically this reason at this point. And then this was one of the most interesting charts to me. This is showing a general approval for what kind of conditions do people approve screening for. So things like cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, schizophrenia all have broad support. This other column over here are traits.
Baldness. I love the baldness one.
Skin color, extroversion, openness to experience. Liz said baldness, height, conscientiousness, intelligence, neuroticism. These things all have sort of minority approval at this point. So what do you take from these?
Yeah, why is that?
Yeah.
Why is it that people are so down with selecting for some conditions and then other traits?
So things like skin color, that's just considered kind of gross and racist to select your kid for skin color.
Yeah.
Something like ADHD or health conditions. That's if you have cancer, that's not considered to be like a part of your identity, right?
Yeah.
But if you have bipolar, that can actually be considered part of your identity, or like your intelligence or how extroverted you are is considered part of your identity. So people, there's a study that was done, I think in the early 2000s on this, that people were more likely to, this was actually about like, would you take a pill to like improve your language learning ability? And so people were more likely to say that they would take a pill to change aspects of their that they didn't consider like part of their identity, right?
Sure.
So like the fact that I can't speak Chinese is not like a fundamental part of my identity. I would take something, but the fact that I'm extroverted, like I wouldn't necessarily take something to change some fundamental aspect of myself. And so that's part of it. Also, I think probably concerns about inequality play into something like intelligence on that right side, those kinds of traits. So you'd have to, I don't think anybody's actually drilled down on the participants. I think I asked the author of this study if they divided between men and women. And I think that she said that there wasn't a big difference, because I've definitely heard people say, men are saying that we should do embryo selection, but it's women who have to go through the pains and travails of IVF. I donated eggs lots of times. I've donated eggs 5 times, and I've been through an IVF cycle myself to bank embryos. And I don't know if my experience is typical, but to me, doing an IVF cycle to make eggs is about 10% of what a pregnancy is in terms of discomfort. So, yeah.
Do you guys think that there will be this discrepancy, though, between what people are willing to admit to in a survey related to genetic screening of embryos and how they would behave and what they find morally allowable versus reprehensible. Like here's the thing that I think might happen. There might be a lot of people saying, oh, I would never select for hair color and skin color and eye color. And then absolutely, people have these preferences, whether or not they feel comfortable admitting them in polite society, and they will exacerbate inequality by, like, their revealed preferences are going to be a little bit different than what they're willing to say in a survey. What do you make of that future?
Yeah, so one interesting thing about positive characteristics is there's like a positive manifold. So on average, a good characteristic like a lower schizophrenia risk correlates positively with something like intelligence or lack of health problems. There's like a positive manifold in that sense. And so you could say, I selected the embryo that had the lowest risk of cancer, but it also happens to be the embryo that has these other qualities that you want. Another aspect of this that's very difficult to regulate, if you think about this from a libertarian perspective, is that with Simone and Malcolm Collins, they were given the genotypes of all these embryos. They put it into software that they had or a program that they had, and they made a spreadsheet choosing their embryo. There's actually a video where you can see Simone looking at the spreadsheet of the embryos.
So this is very DIY.
Yeah, it's very DIY.
Yeah.
And so unless you...
I'm opposed to this because I'm opposed to spreadsheets, not because I'm Catholic.
Yeah. So like in the UK, you're not allowed to select the sex of your offspring, but there are, there's this Human Fertility and Embryo Authority, which if you want to talk about the dystopias, that's one. And the Human Fertility and Embryo Authority prevents you from being able to select the sex of your child. So they release some aspects of the child's genotype to you, but there's some, geneticist who has that information and prevents you from seeing it so that you can't select the sex of your offspring unless it's linked to some kind of health issue. So what you have to do in order to prevent people from selecting for certain characteristics is to actually withhold the genetic data about embryos from parents.
Well, rather, some person somewhere in some agency controlled by the state has access to it. It's just the actual individuals who, actually bear the consequences.
Well, so, I mean,
one thing
I get the sense that, okay.
Well, I want to follow up on that. So here's another possible future scenario that I'm interested in, because I'm obviously like, I'm interested, I'm fascinated. But I am Catholic. And so all of this, my starting place is going to be different than both of yours, right? Because I believe we're created in God's image and we're created very deliberately by our Creator. And I have a strong allegiance to that and belief in that. And that when that is my starting place, many other things are going to follow that will be very different than how it is for you guys. But one thing that I am curious about actually is in terms of outcomes, say this becomes like, near universally done. Will we have a future 100 years from now, or possibly sooner, where it's the religious people, it's the Catholics and maybe even the devout evangelicals who have this visceral opposition and an aversion rooted in their belief to this? And so will we have almost like 30% of the population that's like dumb and sickly religious people, and like 70% that's like incredibly gorgeous, sexy, 6'5", like Adonises that are, never going to die, right? Like, will we have that type of situation created? Because there will be a bunch of people like my family that will choose to continue to conceive naturally and to not screen embryos for certain characteristics.
Yeah, there's been speculation about something like speciation. Not exactly speciation, but there be an underclass and an overclass. But, what is it, like 90% of Catholic women take birth control, Liz?
Yeah.
Like, that's against canon as well, but they don't care because it's better for their family. And I don't think that Catholics who tend to actually be much more technophilic than some other religious groups in the United States, I don't think they're going to be that's going to be like the Haredi.
Because the Northeasterners, they're rich. Those Massachusetts Catholics.
It's going to be like the Haredi and maybe like the Amish and
the Mormons are already hot, so right, like we don't have to worry about them. They already look
this
good.
Commentator in the UK called Toby Young said that we should subsidize embryo screening, and actually there's a correlation between how highly educated you are and how in favor of this you are. So it's actually the people who need it might need intelligence screening the most for their embryos who are the most against it. So I think that's more likely to be where there's a split than among Catholics, who I think are going to just do it secretly.
Or just like ultra religious. Where do you fall? I just mean like a little bit of like, I wonder what the religious people will be perceived as more stupid and sickly in the future if this is sort of like the path that we go down, just hypothetically.
Where do you fall on the question of these more superficial traits where it's very unpopular, these things at the top, baldness, height, extroversion, are these things that you would be in this little dark green minority where you agree that just people should be able to screen for whatever they want to screen for?
I think the question, just to be precise here, the question is like, do you strongly approve of people doing it? I might strongly approve of people doing it, but I would say that they should be allowed to do it, right? And
Okay.
another thing that's interesting is that people are often against screening. So I'm 5 feet tall. People are against screening for things that their parents might not have chosen for them for. And oftentimes when I talk about this on Twitter and other social media, people say, oh, you're saying that because your parents would have selected you. Unclear that my parents would have selected me among 10 embryos. My mother had ideals about a daughter that I did not fulfill. We'll just say that. And, we love each other very much now, but it definitely, my mother would have preferred more Audrey Hepburn than Tomboy. Finally, if you were to give someplace like India access to skin color embryo selection, they would be very interested in that. They would be very interested in having fairer offspring, which as far as I know is not correlated with other good things. So like on average, other than a slightly increased risk of autism, which that I would get into the weeds talking about that, there's been a 400% increase in the diagnosis of autism in the last 10 years. So it's unclear what autism even means anymore. If we're calling Elon Musk and people who smear their feces on walls, they're all in the same grouping of people. I don't think autism means anything anymore as much as it used to. But that correlates positively with intelligence. But basically every other bad thing correlates negatively with selecting for intelligence. If you had a group of people who were strongly selecting for something, there's also bioethical cases. There was a deaf lesbian couple who chose a deaf sperm donor so that they could have a deaf child because they wanted to have a deaf child. There are little people who potentially would choose to have little people as children instead of having a child without a dwarfism, for example. So those, I think, are the edge cases where we're going to have to say, how libertarian are we going to be about what kind of offspring that people can select? I think the majority of people would be okay with people having healthier offspring and more capable offspring, and maybe less likely to approve if people want to have deaf, blind, or short offspring. Yeah.
But are there unknowns so that we should take into account the idea that there might, if we're sort of messing with evolution in this way, or, natural procreation in this way, that now certain traits that are desirable are being selected for more? You mentioned some of the co-occurring negatives that come with the positives, but are there, maybe there's negatives with some of these that we don't even know about, and we're going to create some sort of nightmare scenario that way? Is that
Are we tearing down a fence? Is it okay?
No.
What would Chesterton say, everybody?
So I wrote an article about this. You can link to it. It's on Aporia. It's about some arguments against embryo selection that were in a popular book. So people do talk about this, right? That there could be unknown problems. Okay. One idea has already been proven that it's fine through assortative mating. Smarter people are already more likely to get together, and people with mental illness are already more likely to get together. So there's already assortative mating on those domains. That might be one reason why there's an increase in mental health problems. That's one hypothesis about why that might be the case. People have talked about this possibly being a problem generation after generation. But if you make 10 embryos, it's basically the same as if you had 10 children naturally, and you just chose, instead to have those 10 children naturally, you just chose to have 1 out of the 10. It's not genetic engineering. It's not actually changing the genotype. It's just rolling the die until you get the one that you want. It's not.
But I guess I'm thinking in terms of if we thought about this dog breeds, we know about these weird bulldogs that can't even give birth, or other dogs that have breathing problems because they were bred to look a certain way.
Yeah.
Are we accidentally hurtling towards that? Future.
Pretty much everybody has eugenic intuitions in this respect, right? That it's okay to select a child that's going to be smarter or healthier, and it's not okay to select a child that's going to be less healthy or less smart. And certainly, you can look at some breeds like pugs or bulldogs. They've been selected for fashion, right? If you started allowing people to have children that had enormous foreheads, or had extremely flat noses or couldn't breathe properly because it was just the fashion that it was cute to have a baby that looked like that. Maybe the age of AI, when we actually don't have to do any thinking ourselves, people, there will be fashions like that. But that's a totally different set of criteria. And some of the most amazing animals that we have on this planet are domesticated breeds like border collies, which have some small amount of problems, but compared to something like a pug or a bulldog does not. And there are definitely responsible breeders who also have these eugenic ideas about, trying to make healthier offspring. So I think comparing, doing embryo selection to making pugs, which are also highly inbred, is not really fair because the criteria that people will use are totally different.
I mean, what would you say to religious detractors who are just like, but we're made, by our creator, and we're not, what do you make of the playing God concern? It's one of the most commonly recited ones. Is there any way to address those people's objections, or will we just fundamentally sort of not see eye to eye here?
I mean, go to an old cemetery where there are children who are buried because they died of, rheumatic fever or chicken pox or any number of other diseases. And now we have vaccines for those. People have ascribed all of the terrible things that life hands to them as acts of God, as a way of coping with the terrible effects of nature. People have exalted nature and exalted God because it was the only way they could cope with destiny, with the terrible things that happened to them. I just think that this is no more playing God than giving somebody a vaccine or giving them open heart surgery. You could argue essentially that God intended for somebody to die at a certain young age. So while I am sympathetic to the idea that children are created in God's image and that we're all imbued with a godliness of sorts, because I think that that's a sincerely held belief that you and many other people have, I think there's just only familiarity standing in the way of bringing this on board into people's lives, even highly religious people.
One of my other objections, so this shows where my brain goes, I'm like God and sex. But my other objection is, say we're creating people in the lab, and this is, the dominant means of conceiving children, of creating new life. And say we have a future where maybe people just we're already seeing, younger generations have way less sex than they used to. On one hand, this is good, right? Because we've seen teen pregnancy rates go down drastically. But on the other hand, I wonder what all of the second order impacts are in a society where people stop having sex or have sex way less when they have their replica AI girlfriends and their babies that are conceived in a lab somewhere, but they're not
implanted
actually,
in an artificial womb.
Yeah, but they're
right?
not actually screwing. And so 100 years from now, say everybody has sex a third or a quarter as often, or maybe there's some contingent that's actually having sex and then the vast majority are really not for whatever reason. Are there any consequences that stem from this?
There are already tons of cultures like that. There are cultures in which people only have, sex when they're married, or they don't have very much sex at all. There are natural fertility cultures where people have very few children because they're not that into it. I don't know what the effect is. Somebody like Mary Harrington has made the case that women shouldn't be on birth control because it might reduce their libido. And isn't it exciting to roll the dice every time you have sex that you might make a baby? Liz, is it exciting?
I don't feel the need to comment on this publicly.
But certainly that's a positive way of framing it. It's also, having the risk of having a child every time you have sex.
Does she do that? Does she roll the dice over it?
No, I don't. Okay. I've talked to her in person. I think that she is 45 now, so I don't know if she necessarily has to worry about that.
She has 45-year-old privilege.
Yeah, exactly.
For her, it's a little different than for me.
I've seen this argument made in various ways. Yeah, I think people will still want to have sex, for bonding reasons. And the other possibility, if people don't use IVF, is that you can get non-invasive prenatal testing, which I don't know if you had. Are you religious enough that you didn't have non-invasive prenatal testing? Did they draw your blood to test for Down syndrome and stuff when you were pregnant?
Well, I believe I got that, but I wouldn't have aborted the children if Yeah.
So
No,
imagine that somebody.
I actually disliked the way I handled that because I think pressure was put on me in New York by my doctors to get that screening when I kind of didn't want it, because I was like, look, it's not going to affect my outcomes either way. And I wish I'd actually stood up. I wish I'd just kind of saved myself the procedure and saved myself the money and just said, look, this is irrelevant to me.
Whereas I spent like $1,000 testing for like literally everything. But when I had my blood drawn, you can in the future possibly get the whole genotype of your offspring. So for people who can't afford IVF, they might just decide to abort children until they have one that they like. And I think that is more problematic than using IVF. Would you agree that that's more problematic than using IVF?
I mean, yeah, I'm probably more opposed to abortion than opposed to the disposing of embryos.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's consistent. Like, I don't know if that's consistent with Catholic theology or an especially interrogated belief. I wonder whether that's a little bit of a visceral aversion, especially to a little bit of this belief. But like, I don't know what to make of. I have so many friends who increasingly turn toward IVF, and I don't know how to square what my church says about that with what it's socially you're supposed to nod along. And so I don't know how to reconcile that. And I think I'm probably doing a poor job, truth be told.
Yeah.
What do you, let's say, I mean, we're not even close to being in a world where IVF is going to get banned. There was such a backlash to what happened in Alabama, even from conservatives. But can you just maybe briefly make the case for why you think, just your defense of IVF, Diana?
Okay. Embryos are pre-people. They are not sentient, and it's going to be potentially possible. Maybe they come up with a way in the future of screening the egg and sperm cells such that you don't have to create 100 embryos to pick the best one. You could screen an egg and sperm cell that will necessarily make an embryo. I mean, you could try and move this back a step such that if you don't think that eggs and sperm are sentient or every sperm is sacred, as Monty Python says, but I just think that it's going to have very good social ramifications. I think that there are some sincerely held beliefs. In Israel, they have different, and in Islam, they have different ideas about when life begins. I think that the idea about when life begins, although I say I respect traditionalists, I respect that they have sincerely held beliefs, but the idea about when life begins and when it's acceptable or not acceptable to engage in IVF, or whether it is really arbitrary as to what kind of theology you come from. And I think that genetic screening in the future is going to have huge positive effects, not just for people who have health problems where they don't want to pass those on to their offspring, or they want to choose the best possible life for their children, but also positive externalities for society when it's possible for two people who have very little time and energy to raise a child to choose a child that's going to be the best of both of them, that not only will make their lives a joy, but contribute to society and civilization in ways that another child could not have.
And you mentioned earlier that you personally donated eggs. Why did you do that?
I did that for mostly sort of selfish Darwinian reasons. I wasn't sure that I wanted to have children. I knew some people who were the product of gamete donation that were very happy to exist. And they had been in touch with their biological parents, and they had a very good life because in general, people who use gamete donors want children very badly. It's kind of a last resort that somebody's willing to have an unrelated child. So I wasn't sure I was going to have children at that point. And so I thought, this is really kind of hedging my bets. Like, if I never have children myself, I can meet an adult child and I can have a relationship with somebody that is 50% genetically related to me without, no offense, all of the work of raising my own children. People do call it like altruistic egg donation, but there's a lot in it for the egg donor. In the United States, egg donors are paid a lot. I mostly donated in the UK, where they're paid almost nothing. So I was really doing it for the pure genetic reason for it. Yeah.
Isn't this fundamentally a very narcissistic pursuit? Like, who's to say that Diana Fleischman is the type of person who we need, many, many, many more people out there in the world with her genetic material. On one hand,
I'll say that.
I am biased in favor of this because I like you and, we're friends. But like, there's a little bit of narcissism to unpack here, right? Like you are saying that the gene pool ought to have more of your qualities in it.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things about me that I think are good. One is that I'm smarter than the average person.
I'm trying to phrase this in a way that doesn't put you down because I do legitimately like you.
I'm smarter than the average person. The other thing is that I have a very high hedonic set point. I'm very happy. It's very hard to make me sad. I've not been sad for very much time. And I do think that in general, that is a good quality. But absolutely, to call all egg donors altruistic, it absolutely is a form. But I think it's also a form of narcissism to have your own children. It's just a lot more work.
Yeah, it's a question all parents have to cope with, I think.
Well, Zach, do you feel like a narcissist because you had 3 children? Three, Zach.
Well, look, there's an aspect of what Diana's saying that you want to see some facet of yourself, reflected in the world and continue on.
You could even say, if you were going to extend this concept out, are your memes or your genes more important? And I definitely know people who've said, I want to spread my memes and not spread my genes. And everybody wants to see a mark of themselves on the world. People who are ambitious, everybody wants that.
I think this is something I've actually thought about a little bit less, maybe by nature of my child being conceived accidentally, but also like there's a certain amount of, it's not necessarily so satisfying to see somebody with my genes going through the world. And I think maybe that belief is in part shaped because my family that I came from is mostly, it's like, I have 1 biological sibling, 2 adopted siblings. And so the emphasis on spreading one's genes was always just like lesser. And if anything, there was a little bit more of a gospel sort of against that because that would be kind of an exclusive thing to communicate to our other members of the family. But I think it's always been a little bit rooted less in wanting to see more Lizness in the world and more in the actual practice of parenting. I find it to be like very fascinating and very rewarding. This idea of like the ways in which a parent can be more hands-off or more hands-on and sort of attempting to, my parenting philosophy thus far is so oriented toward trying to step back, trying to observe and trying to correct where necessary, but really just trying to be a little bit, I don't know, I'm so persuaded by all of the Lenore Skenazy free range kids type stuff. And so that's been the most rewarding part of it thus far to me. But I imagine there's also something that I'm failing to unpack there that is like, I like to see the ways in which my natural tendencies and proclivities are reflected in my son. And I think less about the ways in which I'm reflected in my son and more about like, it does delight me to see my husband reflected in him.
Yeah, absolutely. We let seeing the people we love and ourselves and our offspring is beautiful. But now that I'm a mom and I'm sort of sensitized to like maternal instinct, I do think that like I could have adopted a child and loved a child, right? Whereas before I thought, no way would I didn't even know if I would have like a normal maternal instinct. And I know we didn't get into artificial wombs in this conversation, but one reason I had a cesarean with my daughter, I tried very hard not to. And then when they took her away because they needed to give her some antibiotics because she'd been we'd been in labor for too long, I was extremely agitated because I wasn't sure that I would be able to connect to her adequately if they didn't put her directly on my chest. I thought that I wouldn't bond with her and that it would like, that few hours would impact the rest of our lives together. And so I think also that many people I know who are adopted, who have adopted siblings, are the most against this idea of genetics being destiny because they love people that are, not genetically related to them. They found things in common with people who aren't, and they've had maternal instincts, somebody like Amy Comey Barrett, who's adopted many children. And I think that there's a beautiful, selfless, religious, a lot of religious people do that. And I just think that that's absolutely beautiful. I don't know if
how do we explain this in terms of like, why do we do this?
Why do we do what?
Why is it that we can almost trick our bodies and minds into loving people who feeling maternal toward people who aren't genetically related to us?
If you, this is going to sound terrible. If you have a horse that gives birth and she dies and you give the foal to another mare whose foal has died, they just sniff each other for a while. You rub the placenta on her and so the seeing a baby and being around a baby for a long period of time was always coupled with the baby being genetically related to you, right?
Yeah.
Same thing with like a cuckoo. A cuckoo lays an egg in a nest, and the birds take care of the cuckoo. And the cuckoo's like big and loud. They're like, wow, we have a really robust baby here. We're going to take extra special care of it. And so, yeah, there's just not, because people didn't just like drop off their children with us and expect, there's no psychological defenses against that.
Well,
Seeing a baby, being around a baby all day and all night was always coupled with that baby being genetically yours. It's just natural for that adaptation to be, yeah.
I want to ask one other thing. Oh, sorry. Zach,
I was just going to say, just one final aspect of IVF that I wanted to cover is that you didn't really make this in your kind of defense of IVF, but the pronatalist aspect of IVF, the idea that giving people these options, this was implicit in the statement that Greg Abbott made that we read at the beginning, that if people want to have more kids, we should be giving them more tools to have more kids and not making it harder to access those tools.
Yep.
I know that you are an actively pro-natalist person, Diana.
Such a poser. I only have 2 children. I'm such a poser. Yeah.
but you know, I'm curious, like with your evolutionary psychology background, if you could shed a little bit of light on what you think is going on here, because I would think that evolutionary psychology, everything would be geared in the human mind towards procreating, towards having more kids. Is there any insight as to that you can offer as to, you know, what you think is going on at this moment, and what sort of cultural shifts or changes you would like to see happen to reverse the declining birth rate?
Okay, a few thoughts. I think that anybody who liked to have sex ancestrally would have children. Didn't matter if you liked kids, didn't matter if you wanted them, it didn't matter if you'd be a good parent. If you like to have sex, which everybody does at some point, or somebody else wants to have sex with you enough that you don't mind, then you will end up having kids regardless. So I think that this like desire to have children as a prerequisite for having children is, you know, totally a novel thing. The natalism people have talked about like whether or not things like, I don't know, legalizing surrogacy or making surrogacy more easily available, or artificial wombs, or IVF, or subsidizing IVF is going to have an increase, an effect on the birth rate. It's unlikely to. You know, the thing that's the kind of easiest way to get to a higher birth rate would be something like taking somebody who's traditional, who wants to have 4 kids, and instead encouraging them to have 5 or 6. Encouraging people who have 0 kids to have 1 kid is, you know, pretty low on the way of reversing the birth rate free fall. Were you gonna say something?
No.
And yeah, we just don't have an automatic desire. And then also things like status, and when you're a teenager and a young adult, you want to do things like conspicuously consume. You want to have like nice things. You want to have a car. You want to have a nice house. You want to have status at your job. And those kinds of things are directly in conflict with having children. And even though we evolved to seek status or to become attractive, to become attractive to the opposite sex, and these were all means to an end of having children, now we are, widely on contraception. And so those not endpoints seem more important than the endpoint itself. And I've also seen, I've called it a psyop, but maybe it's not a psyop, where people are like, oh, you know, birth control is like really bad for you, and it like screws you up, and it makes you sad, and it makes you anxious, and it has all these different problems. And I think that trying to discourage women from taking birth control, you know, would be a major way of increasing the birth rate, because people just accidentally be having more kids. But I just don't, you know, I think that birth control is pretty benign, and I find a lot of the controversy around it to be pretty cynical. Yeah.
What is your best defense of rebranding the term eugenics? I know you are a proud user of the term eugenics, and it rubs a lot of people the wrong way, and, you know, gets you into some trouble sometimes. What's your best defense for why that term needs to be thought of differently?
Eugenics has a definition, and eugenicists have been some of the smartest, most progressive, and most desiring of a brighter future, you know, people in our history. There's also been, you know, crazy racists and things like that. But there was also
some prominent anti-Semites too.
Yeah,
maybe?
so yeah, for sure. But you know, the concept itself of eugenics, it's just impossible to get away from. So in my piece, You're Probably a Eugenicist, I talk about George Church, who came up with this Digidate app, which would only connect you with people who didn't have genes that would cause you to have a child who had a serious, genetic defect. So it's like matching, but instead of swiping right, it just automatically excludes people who are not genetically compatible with you. And people call that eugenics. And that is technically eugenics, right? So I think that if we redeem the word eugenics, then we can say, yeah, that is. And what does it matter? Just because something is eugenics is not necessarily says anything about whether it's good or bad. It just says that its intention is to improve the genetic complement of future generations. And I also talk a little bit about, not enough, I have to write something about this, about how euthanasia has been redeemed. So in lots of places, like in Canada, there's the assisted dying program, and people call that euthanasia. Euthanasia is what the Nazis called killing disabled people. And yet that word has been redeemed because detractors were so likely to say this is euthanasia that I think eventually people were like, yeah, it is euthanasia. And what does that matter? And so I think that instead of this, there's this huge euphemism treadmill of different words, things like genetic screening. And if we just say, yeah, this is all eugenics, then it'll be much easier to have a conversation about these concepts without having this really dumb, I think, semantic discussion on the front end of it.
But is euthanasia even really being redeemed? Isn't Canada's program attracting a ton of heat?
It is, but you can't just say that's euthanasia and end of discussion the way you can say that's eugenics and end of discussion, right? You say that's euthanasia, somebody will say, yeah, sure.
Instead, now it's people's very sly way of insulting somebody on Twitter, I wish Canadian healthcare upon them. It's basically kill yourself, except in different terms.
What would you suggest people do or clarify their thoughts when they're talking about the inarguably terrible applications of eugenics that we've seen? Is it all about this coercion and state power, or what should they be criticizing instead of
top-down state power? But it's very easy. Sterilizing somebody without their consent is wrong because it violates their bodily autonomy. Murdering somebody is wrong because it's murder, not because it's eugenics, right? And so there's a very easy way of talking about all of the wrongs that have been done in the name of eugenics because they violated people's autonomy or they violated their right to life, as opposed to saying it was wrong because it was eugenics. It's not any more wrong, in my view, to kill somebody because you don't like them or they made a pass at your wife than to kill them because they had a genetic disorder. So somebody who has written against my view is Richard Hanania has written a rebuttal and says, eugenics can't be redeemed. We need to just kind of dispense with the word entirely. And,
Does
I'm also...
Mr. Hanania really have the legs to stand on in all this?
Well, he's definitely a eugenicist, but he just doesn't want... His whole argument is that the word is bad and that we should use the word. So his argument is entirely semantic as well, right?
So I noticed that I was reading that you left academia and you say it's because of free speech issues so that you could speak more freely. No. Is this an example of why? Oh, okay.
You see, you're a good tornadolist after all.
Yeah, no, I mean, my husband and I were in a long distance relationship for 5 years. And I said, we can't really have a child with an ocean between us. And so we tried many different ways. I mean, it's partly because I'm problematic that it was hard for us to get a job in the same place, for sure. But it's almost impossible for people, John Tooby and Lita Cosby, these pioneers of our field, they took many, many years to get a job in the same place. And they were both absolutely brilliant and prolific. And so it's also an aspect of evolutionary psychology. And, just that academia is becoming less hospitable for controversial ideas, but also less thriving generally.
Yeah. So, talk about just a little bit before we wrap up about what you see as having happened to evolutionary psychology as a field. It seems like it's taken a lot of heat. There's people who are worrying. This is article you responded to, how the incels warped my research, by Daniel Conroy Beam, who is an evolutionary psychologist, who says that these ideas are getting appropriated by all the bad people, the incels, the manosphere, the far right wingers, and that people like you, the provocateurs are only making it worse. What's your
I mean, I
reply?
feel for Dan LaColor-Beebe. We were in the same lab briefly, and he's just trying to do his math models and interpret them and write papers and stuff. And then there's people like me and my husband and Gad Sad and just trying to redeem eugenics or talking about women's boobs and oh God, why would these people just shut up? And it's they feel like it reflects badly on them to be associated with evolutionary psychology. But that's because they're progressives, and progressives are intolerant of other people's viewpoints. There are evolutionary psychologists who think that I'm a really terrible person. And there are evolutionary psychologists who have all kinds of views that I disagree with. And I don't care enough to say, no, these people, they can't call themselves evolutionary psychologists, or they're provoking a reaction from people. And so, evolutionary psychology, as I describe in my rebuttal to that piece, is always been controversial. Saying that there are sex differences is controversial. Saying that there are cynical explanations for, love and sociality and generosity is controversial. And even when E.O. Wilson wrote sociobiology back in the 70s, when only the few pages that he talked about humans were extremely controversial. So yes, applying the ideas that we use to explain animal behavior to humans has always been controversial. And that is partly why evolutionary psychologists are people who enjoy controversy, who are provocateurs, either intentionally or unintentionally. And, in my rebuttal to that piece, I just say, we should be a big tent, and people should be allowed to say what they want to say. And I don't think that saying that a mentally ill person was a fan of a certain field reflects necessarily badly on that field. If you're not making a call to violence or talking about how to genetically engineer a pathogen to kill people, then you're not responsible for what crazy people do who commit violence, essentially.
But is there any validity to the criticism, and this is the one that's been thrown around about evolutionary psychology forever, which is that there's some of its proponents oversimplify or create these just so stories where they're explaining a social phenomenon with this theory without really, and there's not really much scientific basis. You can't falsify it. Is there is that a common problem in evolutionary psychology, or is that kind of a dated criticism at this point?
There's a guy called Laith Al-Shawaf who's written some very good defenses of evolutionary psychology, including the falsifiability question. Just to give an example, ovulatory shifts, the idea that women liked dominant men, more symmetrical men, etc., when they were ovulating in the cycle, has been a really hot level area of research all through the 2000s. And now some larger studies are saying that some of this data wasn't necessarily good, although I think the theoretical basis of some of these ideas was fine. So there have been evolutionary psychology ideas that are been falsified. Another example is this idea that gay men are engaging in kin altruism. So they invest more in their nieces and nephews instead of in their own offspring. And that's the way that they make, not having their own offspring work. Among American gay men, they don't actually spend more time or money on their nieces and nephews than the average man. And so there definitely been, I could rattle off 10 other ideas that are evolutionarily based that have been falsified by data. And certainly we make up stuff, but everybody makes up stuff. Political scientists make up stuff, and then you have to find data to support it. And if something is pure speculation, but people find it interesting, I don't think it's any harm to talk about it, just as long as it's flagged up as, this is speculation.
Okay, so I want to wrap our conversation up, but before we go, we have one last question that we ask all our guests now. And it's this: Diana Fleischman, what is one question that you think more people should be asking?
Oh my gosh. Oh, I wish I had watched more of you guys to know where this was going.
Wow, admitting that you're not a huge Just Asking Questions fan.
No, I definitely have. I watched your Coleman debate all the way to the end.
So did everyone. I got in trouble for that.
We're not live. I can take a minute to think about this, right?
Of course.
Sure. Yeah.
What's a question that people need to be asking more of? More people should be asking if it's not better to have, more states or districts or people making their own policies and laws such that we actually see real world experiments about what works and what doesn't in terms of governance.
Love that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for talking to Reason.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Just Asking Questions. These conversations appear on Reason's YouTube channel and the Just Asking Questions podcast feed every Thursday. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate and review the show.